In our session today, we are going to be talking about teenage behaviour and what we think we know about teenagers. And through the session, we're going to address four main misconceptions. Firstly, that teenagers are completely irrational beings and capable of making any good decisions. We're also going to challenge the idea that teenagers are missing a vital part of the brain known as the prefrontal cortex. We're going to question the idea that teenagers will blindly do whatever it is their friends tell them to do. And finally, we're going to really address this misconception that all teenagers are simply lazy. So before we come on to teenage brain and behaviour, I just want to do a very quick overview of the organisation of the brain. So we know that the brain is roughly organised into three main sections. Here in the brown area there, we've got our cerebellum and brainstem. This is the oldest part of the brain, sometimes referred to as the reptilian brain. It controls all of our vital functions like breathing and heart rate. Just above that, we have this red area of the brain that's known as the limbic system. Now that's our emotional centre. That is controlling any emotion that we feel. It's generating feelings like happiness, sadness. It's also the part of the brain that's responsible for rewarding us for engaging in activities and behaviours that we find enjoyable. So when we reach for a big bar of chocolate and we eat that chocolate and we enjoy that chocolate because this part of the brain is telling us to enjoy it. The reward network of the brain is activated. And then we have the outer layer of the brain known as the cerebral cortex. This controls all of our higher cognitive functions, our ability to speak, to think, to reason, to plan. All of these functions that define us as human, they're all contained here in the cerebral cortex. So crucially, the cerebral cortex is the part of the brain that tells us, as much as we might be enjoying that chocolate that we're eating, the cerebral cortex kicks in and tells us to stop eating it when we begin to feel sick. So that brings us to our first misconception. Teenagers are irrational. I'd just like you to think for a moment of some of the words that come to mind when I say the word teenager. You might think of words such as risky, emotional, thoughtless, creative perhaps, and lazy. Actually, what we know is some of those behaviours that we see during adolescence are reflected throughout the animal kingdom. It's not just a human condition. Adolescence is a period that begins at the onset of puberty and extends until an animal reaches full sexual maturity. And we see this developmental period across the animal kingdom. For humans, the period of adolescence generally extends, we think now, until the mid-20s. Sarah Jane Blakemore is a neuroscientist, a professor of neuroscience, and an expert in adolescent brain development. If you've not read her most recent book, I can highly recommend it. In this book, she summarises this adolescent condition. Now, one of the things that we know that happens during adolescence is an increasing emphasis is placed on the opinion of our peers. And this was most notably demonstrated in an excellent piece of research conducted by Lawrence Steinberg and colleagues. What he did in this experiment was he took groups of mice and he exposed the mice to alcohol. He gave the mice the option to drink alcohol, and they were given the option to drink the alcohol either alone or in the presence of their friends, their micey mates. Interestingly, what he found was the adolescent mice consumed more alcohol when they were in the presence of their peers, of their micey mates. For the adolescent mice, it made no difference whether they had any friends present or not. So really interestingly, we're seeing in the animal world this kind of increasing emphasis placed on peers and the influence of peers during the adolescent period. Now that same concept has been replicated in the lab with human adolescents using a simulated driving game. So this is a well-used paradigm that's featured in a lot of research and been replicated many times. And in this experiment, teenagers are brought into the lab and they're asked to play a simulated driving game. And they're asked to play that driving game either alone or in the presence of their friends. During the game, they're rewarded for completing the level quickly, and they're given lots of opportunities to either engage in some risky behaviour or to avoid those risks. Now, what we find is when teenagers are playing this game, the number of risks that they take significantly increases when they play the game in the presence of their friends compared to when they play the game alone. So we see that same pattern of behaviour reflected in the mice, reflected in human adolescents as well. There's something that's happening in the brain that places an increased emphasis on the opinion of their peers, and that leads to engaging in risky behaviours. Now, when we've actually looked at activity taking place in the brain during this game, what we find is that limbic system within the brain, that reward network in the brain, is activated whenever a teenager does something risky during the driving game. When they choose to take a risk, such as running an amber light, for example, we see activity in the reward network of the brain when they know their friends are watching them. What's really interesting is that that activity in the reward network of the brain is reduced when their friends are not watching. So even if the teenager engages in a risky decision during the driving game, their brain activation in that reward network of the brain is not so high if they're playing alone. So what does this mean? What it's telling us is when a teenager engages in something risky in the presence of their friends, their brain is actually rewarding them for doing it. It's actually making them feel good for doing something risky. In a fantastic variation on this experiment, the researchers brought in the teenagers' mums to sit with them while they played the driving game. Any guesses what happened to their level of risk when their mums were present observing? Well, we see a massive drop in the number of risky behaviours the teenagers engage in, and equally we also see a decrease in the reward network activity in the brain as well. So if we want to mitigate risky behaviour in our teenagers, mums, we just need to follow teenagers around permanently. So this brings me to our second misconception, that teenagers have no prefrontal cortex. There's a vital part of their brain that's missing during this period of development. Well, that's not entirely incorrect, but actually what we find, it's not that that part of the brain is missing, it's just that that part of the brain is undergoing massive reorganisation and development throughout the period of adolescence. So from when puberty starts until full sexual maturity is reached, there's a lot of reorganisation taking place in this area of the brain here known as the prefrontal cortex. Now, the prefrontal cortex, this is the most recent part of the brain to develop. Evolutionarily speaking, it was the last part of the brain, and it's the part of the brain that separates us from our closest primate relatives. The prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that's responsible for controlling our decision making, our ability to plan for the future, to multitask. All of that activity takes place in the prefrontal cortex. Now, what's happening during adolescence is the connectivity from the prefrontal cortex through to other regions of the brain is being strengthened and refined. So as adults, we might have a particular emotional response to something. We'll feel an emotion very, very strongly, but we can then choose to control that emotion and choose what our reaction is going to be. We're able to do that because we have full connectivity from the prefrontal cortex through to those other areas of the brain. For teenagers, that connectivity is still developing. So this is an image that was taken from one of the research projects that Brain Can Do collaborated with the University of Reading on. And as a part of this research project, a number of pupils from Queen Anne's School visited Reading University to participate in an fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging brain scan. These are some of the images that were generated from that scan. These are state-of-the-art images, and what these images show is the connectivity between different regions of the brain. So if we could imagine just peeling back this outer cortical layer, this is what we would see just underneath. And this is what's happening to the prefrontal cortex during adolescence. It's this connectivity throughout the brain that's being strengthened and refined. So all of these fibers that connect the prefrontal region to other areas of the brain, that's what's being built on and strengthened during adolescence. And that's what enables us to exert some kind of control over our emotions and over our emotional responses. The challenging thing for teenagers is whilst this area of the brain is undergoing massive development, this area of the brain, the limbic system, is already at full maturity. So what we have for teenagers is they're experiencing the emotional reactions similar to those of an adult, without the necessary infrastructure to be able to control them appropriately, necessarily. And this can lead to the kind of spikes in mood that we see during adolescence and some of the more explosive reactions and behavioural reactions from teenagers. It's just that the connectivity from the prefrontal area is not yet at full capacity. Now, I've been referring to teenagers throughout this talk as one homogeneous group, making a blind assumption that all the teenagers act and respond in the same way, and of course they don't. Anyone who's spent any time with teenagers knows that the pattern of behaviour is massively varied. In some interesting work from Humphreys et al., they looked at how personality intersects with all of the other things happening during adolescence to feed into risky behaviour. In this paradigm, they asked participants to pump up a balloon and to keep pumping the balloon, and the challenge was to get that balloon as full as you possibly could before it burst. So if you could get that balloon very, very full, but it would not burst, you would get points awarded. And so the task was to see just how far people would push it in trying to pump up that balloon. Now they did this, and they also took a measure of personality. And what they found was, perhaps unsurprisingly, in the teenage cohort that they were working with, those teenagers who scored highly on a measure of sensation seeking, which is an indicator of how keen they are to experience new things and try new things, those who were high in sensation seeking were more likely to take risks. And actually, more often than not, the balloon burst, and they weren't overly successful at the task. Interestingly, they also measured something called associative sensitivity. Now, associative sensitivity is a measure of how likely a person is to learn from experience, reflect on those past experiences, and use that information to inform future decisions. They found that those teenagers who scored highly on this measure, who had very high associative sensitivity, they were much less risky, but also much more successful at the task overall. So, what this research tells us is, yes, even though we know about the reorganisation happening at a neural level during the period of adolescence, it's incredibly complex, and personality will intersect with that brain development to create patterns of risky behaviour, and can help to explain why we might see a riskier behaviour in some teenagers than others. So to bring me back to our second misconception, hopefully we've seen that teenagers do in fact have a prefrontal cortex. That part of the brain is there, there's no gaping hole, but it is the connectivity from this region to the rest of the brain that's being strengthened, and this can make cognitive control and emotional regulation quite a challenge during the teenage years.